We're now going to move from labor markets to trade, the other big area that impacts the living standards of Americans. And again, it's a multifaceted set of questions. Is it simply that other countries pay their workers less money and that flows through to the cost of products? Or is it that we have a one-sided trading system with rules that advantage countries that have industrial policies that we deny to ourselves, so that American industry goes into partnership with foreign governments who can enforce very low wages on their own workers? And so it isn't just the wages, it's industrial innovation that leaves America with fewer areas where we produce, and where we do produce we have lower wages. Is it some kind of witch's brew of the interplay of low labor standards and the lack of any kind of trade policy that benefits the United States? Complicated set of questions. And if so, by the way, why? Cui bono? Who benefits from a set of ground rules that helps American industry but doesn't help American workers, doesn't help American consumers, except to the extent that they get to go to Walmart, but then on the other hand, they go to Walmart because they make such little money that it's the only place they can afford to shop. So here to help us with all of this is Rob Scott, who's the Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy Research at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. Rob's areas of research include international economics and trade agreements, their impact on working people in the United States and other countries, the economic impacts of foreign investment, and the macroeconomic effects of trade and capital flows. His research has been widely published in professional and popular journals, and it's a pleasure to welcome Rob Scott.
Bob, thank you. Bob, thanks very much for that kind introduction, and Pat, thanks for organizing this this program. I enjoyed Robert Poland's great introduction on the subject of labor markets, and I will pick up some of those themes in my remarks today, and I'm sure we'll continue the discussion throughout the day. I primarily focus on labor markets in my work and the way in which trade and capital flows affect working people, and so this discussion I'm going to present today will weave some of those themes together. The topic is the rise of the globalization of capital and the rise of the multinational. And I think that's an important lens, an important way of slicing the globalization process, and gives us, I think, important insights into how it works. And I think it's important to step back for a minute and just focus on how capital has been globalized in the past 30 or 40 years, this era of globalization that we've been talking about. The growth of capital flows has played a key role in this process. And I'll give you some numbers. I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but just to get a feel for the data. In the United States, in the last 30 years, our real gross domestic product, our total output of our economy, has been growing about 3.2% a year. U.S.-owned assets abroad, again in real dollars, have increased 8.7% a year, 3 times as fast. Real foreign direct investment by U.S. multinationals has increased 6.1% a year, twice as fast as GDP growth. And real foreign direct investment by foreign multinationals in the United States has grown even faster, at 9.5% per year. Again, 3 times as fast as GDP growth. So there has been an acceleration in the growth of capital. It has grown much faster than output, and it has played a key role in the globalization process. And if you step back even further and just look at financial trading, that overwhelms these capital flows. The Bank of International Settlements just recently published a report that showed that average daily trading in foreign exchange markets and derivatives and those sorts of things reached $4 trillion a day. in April of 2010. That's versus an annual world GDP. That's a yearly GDP of about $63 trillion. So it just boggles the mind how much trading is taking place in foreign exchange and debt securities. Now, multinationals have played a key role in trade and development. And they play a couple of different roles that I want to describe briefly. In the past, US multinationals invested abroad in order to gain access. The model here was Europe. We invested heavily in Western Europe in the 70s and 80s to gain access to ship exports to those markets. And in 1999, US multinationals exported more than they imported. They had a trade surplus of about $50 billion. Now, at that time, the U.S. had a trade deficit of almost over $300 billion, so actually U.S. multinationals were offsetting that. They were contributing to demand in this country. But that's changed. Over the past decade, U.S. multinationals have outsourced large amounts of manufacturing work to other countries, especially low-wage countries. And as a result, they have become net importers of goods. So in 2009, the last year for which we have data, U.S. multinational firms were net importers of about $125 billion worth of goods. They had total trade of about $1.3 trillion, so tremendous amounts of trade, but a net trade deficit of $125 billion. That was about a quarter of the overall U.S. trade deficit. Now, what about foreign multinationals? Foreign multinationals invest here to gain market access. They follow model number one. They come here to gain access to U.S. markets and to acquire technologies from U.S. firms that they purchase. Foreign multinationals had a trade deficit of $275 billion. That is, U.S. subsidiaries of foreign multinationals had a trade deficit of $275 billion in 2009. That was actually more than half of a total U.S. trade deficit. So you add them up together, U.S. multinationals trading with their subsidiaries abroad, and foreign multinationals trading with their subsidiaries in this country, they're responsible for 80% of the U.S. trade deficit in goods in 2009. Now, federal officials in this country like to, and state officials love to have press releases and make announcements about the wonderful benefits of insourcing every time there's a new factory built in the United States by Hyundai or Honda, or even if a Chinese company comes here and buys up a U.S. Maker of auto parts, that's greeted in the business press as a good thing. But these data suggest that, in fact, these foreign investors are actually adding to the U.S. trade deficit. Research by the Commerce Department shows that for every foreign auto plant set up in the United States over the last 14 years, each new employee they hire displaces about 6.1 U.S. workers who've been laid off in other companies. And the reason for that is pretty simple. If Hyundai builds a plant in Alabama, their production is going to displace, generally, sales that would have come from Ford or General Motors. The market share of U.S. automakers has fallen steadily for several decades. It's turned up in the last couple of years, but generally speaking, U.S. firms have been losing share. The average domestic content of a U.S. car is about 65 to 75%. So most of the jobs created and supported to produce that car are here in the United States. The domestic content of a car, of a Korean car that's built here is probably closer to 15 or 20%. And so most of the jobs associated with that car are located abroad. I want to, just to set the stage for the discussion, give you some background trends on what's been going on globally with FDI. I think to help think about not just about the U.S. The U.S. and Europe are the biggest recipients of foreign direct investment in the world. Europe had $5 trillion in 2010. The U.S. had about $2.7 trillion. However, China has increasingly become one of the largest hosts to foreign direct investment. Investment in China grew from $369 billion in 2004 to $1.5 trillion in 2010, and now the third largest host to FDI in the world. Hong Kong is number 5 at $1 trillion. Amongst developing countries, other large hosts include China and Brazil. So increasingly, foreign direct investment is a two-way street, both coming to the United States and increasingly going to third world countries. Now, growing trade surpluses, as Bob suggested earlier, have played a key role in China's very rapid growth and development over the past decade. Much of it has been driven by multinational companies, not just U.S. multinationals, but multinationals like Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company making goods for Apple and other electronics firms. They are now the largest employer in China. Such foreign invested enterprises produced over half of China's trade in 2010 and are responsible for almost 70% of its trade surplus. So again, foreign direct investment plays a key role in trade for China. Now, making the connection between trade and FDI and jobs, as I said, that's my area of interest. China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, which is a key line of demarcation for China's development. China's entry into the WTO made it a much more secure place for foreign investors to put their capital. That's one reason why FDI in China has grown so rapidly. China also offered many benefits to foreign investors, such as access to free or low-cost land, factories. They subsidize inputs like basic inputs like energy and steel and glass and paper. They also prohibit free and independent trade unions. You can only belong to the all-China trade union in China, and it doesn't really represent workers, as we saw again in the Foxconn story. Finally, they've also suppressed their currency, which acts like a subsidy to everything they export and a tax on all their imports. Many of these policies conflict with what China promised to do under the WTO, and yet they've helped it grow and prosper. And my research has shown that the rapid growth of FDI in China and its rapidly growing trade with the U.S. Has led to growing trade deficits and job losses in this country. I'll just give you the numbers quickly. In 2001, the U.S. had a trade deficit of about $84 billion with China. That more than tripled through 2010. The U.S. imports from China exceed exports by more than 4 to 1. My research has showed that the growth of this trade deficit between the U.S. and China has displaced about 2.8 million jobs in the United States. About 2/3 of those were in manufacturing. So China trade has played a key role in the decline of the U.S. manufacturing sector. And the growth of these trade deficits has also contributed to the financial bubbles that Bob has talked about, because as China has accumulated trade surpluses, they've also accumulated great wealth, and they've invested much of that wealth in U.S. Treasury securities, drove interest rates down and contributed to the housing bubble here. So China has played a key role in destabilizing the world economy over the last decade. We saw similar patterns in FDI and trade and employment after the North American Free Trade Agreement took effect, particularly if you look at Mexico. NAFTA took effect in 1994. It was a template for more than a dozen FTAs the U.S. has negotiated under both Clinton and Bush and now Obama since that date. What NAFTA did was to provide a secure business environment and offered many benefits, again, to foreign investors. It required Mexico and Canada to eliminate many trade and industrial policies that businesses objected to, things such as requirements for local content, requiring that firms export a minimum share of what they produce, or they hire a certain number of local managers. All of that was eliminated under NAFTA. Furthermore, NAFTA created a unique set of investor protections under what's known as the investor state chapter. That chapter included what's known as a dispute resolution system, which is essentially a non-judicial or extrajudicial process where companies can actually sue companies if they feel their profits have been infringed upon by government regulations. And there have been more than 24 such cases and hundreds of millions of dollars awarded to multinational companies. And that's had a chilling effect on regulations throughout North America. And again, this has tilted the playing field in favor of multinationals and against, in many ways, working people. And I guess that's one of my take-home themes in this remark. The effects of NAFTA on trade and jobs are very similar to what we saw with China. The U.S. had balanced trade with Mexico prior to NAFTA. After NAFTA took effect, foreign direct in Mexico soared. FDI was about 1% of GDP in the decade before NAFTA. In the 15 years after, it averaged about 3% of gross domestic product in Mexico. So foreign investors, both U.S. and from other countries, poured into Mexico, set up factories for export to the United States. As a result, we developed a trade deficit of about $97 billion with Mexico in 2010, and that displaced about 700,000 jobs. Again, 2/3 of them in manufacturing. Most of those came out of the auto sector, and so it had a particularly devastating effect in the upper Midwest, in the so-called Rust Belt states. We could spend a whole hour talking about what you do about this. I tend to agree with many of the things that Bob Poland suggested earlier. I think that we need to certainly dramatically increase investments in infrastructure and education and training, in part because I think we need to make those investments to become more competitive. I do think the United States has developed large structural trade deficits, and we need to make investments in order to be able to generate new products that we can sell to the rest of the world to eliminate those deficits and to help rebuild U.S. manufacturing. I do think part of the solution is to rebalance trade flows. This development of heavily imbalanced trade and financial flows in the global economy, I think has destabilized not just the U.S., but actually many parts of the global economy. The housing crisis we had here in the U.S. was replicated in Europe, even though they didn't have the big trade imbalances that we had. I think it's all connected in many ways, this globalization of capital. The G20 has agreed that we need to eliminate these chronic global trade and capital imbalances. One of the keys to doing that is for China and other Asian countries to they've been manipulating their currencies. They need to raise the value of those currencies by 30 to 40% relative to the dollar. And that will help make us more competitive, not just in China, but around the world. I think that's a start. So with that, I think I'll stop and we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
So let me ask a couple questions, and then we'll
Sure.
throw it open. So is the problem trade itself, or is the problem of the particular ground rules of trade that we have and the behavior of many foreign countries, in the sense that other countries practice a kind of mercantilism where the state prohibits certain behaviors that would otherwise be permitted in a free market economy. The state provides certain kinds of subsidies. The state, in the case of China, prohibits American companies, for the most part, from producing for the domestic China market. The point is to create export platforms so American capital combines with cheap Chinese labor and then exports back into the U.S. market. And there are variants of this in Korea and Japan. Meanwhile, we, the United States, we don't do this. We don't believe in industrial policy except when we tolerate somebody else's industrial policy.
Right.
So to what extent is the problem that we have the wrong ground rules for the trading system because the agenda that the United States government sets is dictated by American multinationals for their self-interest rather than the self-interest of the broad American public? Or is it also that because the United States is relatively high-wage country still compared to newly emerging countries, that even if we had a more symmetrical set of trade rules, hundreds and hundreds of millions of workers in the world with access to the same technology that our workers have would work for 50 cents an hour?
Right.
And how do you address each of the horns of this dilemma?
Well, and let me add a question to your question to put a point on it that is frequently asked. I frequently get asked, is the problem simply that U.S. auto workers are paid too much? Is that really the core problem? And that we can never compete with workers in China that make $1.25
Or as
an hour?
Keynes would say, is it that Chinese workers are paid too little?
Exactly. And I think it's certainly some of both. Clearly, we know that China needs to raise domestic consumption, and I think as Bob Poland said earlier, one of the ways to do that is for China to have higher wage levels. But I think to go to the heart of your question is it inevitable that we are not going to be able to compete with low-wage countries, Mexico, workers in Mexico and China, and maybe in Vietnam and Malaysia and who knows where, India certainly. And I think the answer is, as I read it, is no. There are plenty of examples of countries with higher wages, and I think we'll hear about some of this from Harold in the next hour, for example, the U.S. Manufacturing wages are actually, if you look at international comparisons, somewhere in the middle of the OECD countries. Workers in manufacturing in the United States average about, I think, $30 an hour, whereas workers in Germany are making about $48 an hour. And yet, over the last decade or 15 years, Germany has managed to maintain a large and growing trade surplus with the rest of the world, while the U.S. has developed this large trade deficit. Germany's share of world exports has remained stable, while the U.S. share of world exports has declined dramatically from about 12% in the year, I think, 2000 to about 8% today. So we have lost tremendous amounts of global market share because of our failure to keep up with the competition, especially in Western Europe. I think we can't compete with China or Vietnam or Mexico in apparel production. We can't hope to, for the most part. Maybe mechanized production of jeans, but for the most part, garment production, and footwear production, toy production, those are industries of the past. But we can compete in production of durable goods like autos and machine tools, aircraft. Those are high-wage industries, high productivity, where we can maintain market share. And I'll leave it to Harold to talk a lot more about what the Germans do that's different, but it is a different model. I will simply tell one story paper we just published, I published with a colleague at EPI a couple of months ago, which looked at trade in auto parts with China, and this is a big issue. We looked at China's global trade in auto parts. China has become the largest producer and consumer of autos in the world. For the first time last year, they were the biggest auto market in the world, bigger than the United States. And they both produce and consume large quantities of auto parts. Many of the cars made in China are being made by General Motors and the Western European companies and Japanese and Korean companies. They're all there. And if you examine trade in auto parts, there's a fundamental difference. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have large trade deficits with China in auto parts. Japan, Korea, and Germany all have trade surpluses in auto parts with China. Now, it's the same industry. The wages paid in Germany and Japan are higher than the United States. How is it that they can have a trade surplus in auto parts, which are not, in many cases, high-tech products, and we are running these large trade deficits? And part of the answer is that the U.S. multinationals have decided they want the auto parts industry to be in China. They are telling their auto parts makers, you must move to China, you must match the China price. They have chosen the low-wage route to competitiveness. And I think that has not been the route that's been chosen by certainly German producers. Yeah.
So if I hear you right, it's not only that countries like Korea or Japan have industrial policies and have more assertive trade policies in their national interest, but that their multinationals have internalized the industrial policies, even to some extent the Germans. I've called this soft mercantilism. It's not that there's a commissar in Germany directing industrial policy, but that German entrepreneurs have a setting somewhere in their DNA that says we need to produce in Germany. And so no one has to tell them that, whereas our people don't have much, except when it's time to say the Pledge of Allegiance, don't have much allegiance to the United States. Is that right?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I think part of it has to do with the financial structure in Germany. I don't want to steal too much of Harold's talk here. I've read a lot of what you've written. But, I know banks play a much larger role in financing companies than they do in the U.S., which is much more dependent on the stock market. And so those quarterly returns become much more important here than they are in Germany. The government plays a much larger role in turn in telling the banks what to tell the companies to do. And of course, in Germany, you have the co-determination system with workers sitting on the boards and directors of the companies. So it's a very different institutional framework, and I think that gives it a different approach.
Thank you. For those listening at home or watching at home, this is the Cambridge Forum. We're talking about globalization. Rich Rosen.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So I'm a numbers guy, so I want to come back to your 30 or 40% increase in the Chinese currency as being appropriate, and I don't know all the criteria you have in mind, but maybe we could unpack that a bit, especially in light of this last point that even when wages are higher, say for making auto parts, some countries have a surplus and some have a deficit with China or wherever. Why then would only a 30 or 40% increase in the Chinese currency really help much? If we go back to the shirt example that Bob Powen gave, he said a 100% increase in labor would yield a 2% increase in retail cost here. Granted, of course, labor is only a fraction of what's embedded in the cost of any product. Right? We have capital and energy and labor. Those are probably most of the, the cost components. But I'm just saying, I hear this in the New York Times. Krugman mentions numbers like 20, 30%. A lot of people throw around numbers. I mean, are you afraid to say we need 100% or 200% increase in the Chinese currency? Or where does the 30 to 40% come from? I mean, I just don't get that that's even close.
Currency is only one part of the solution. And currency revaluation is a double-edged sword. It's good if China revalues. It makes our exports more competitive. It's also going to make imports more expensive. and that's going to hurt working people. So you want to see the dollar driven somewhat lower, but you don't want to simply compete by being the cheapest source of goods in the world. And I think there are many other things that we can do. There's much that we can do to learn from other countries who have more effective trade and industrial policies. I think we also need to make those investments that Bob Poland was talking about in infrastructure and education and in training and in R&D to make those competitive products. So I think, and I think also we need to re-examine the rules of the road. I think there are pieces of the world trading system that work, and we need to enforce some of those pieces so that China, for example, doesn't subsidize everything. That's not allowed under the WTO rules, and we should enforce that better. But there are pieces of it that I think we have to rethink, like, for example, the government procurement agreement. We're the only country in the world that abides by the government procurement agreement, which says that you have to open up competition to companies from everywhere in the world on any government purchase of goods and services. And other countries have signed that agreement, but somehow most of the contracts end up going to their own domestic companies. So I think we may need to rethink that one.
Well, I agree there's a lot of other components involved in terms of what we should try to do to improve our economy in general. But I still would like to focus on just the currency aspect. I mean, are there any good papers or models that have been used to compute the effect? Because one thing you raised, which is interesting, I hadn't thought about before, is if the Chinese currency goes up too quickly because our imports will increase in price, that will have transitional effects and impacts on our consumers. Granted, we want to avoid, crashing the economy because transitions occur too quickly, but still, where does the 30 to 40% come from? Research?
The 30 to 40% comes from Bill Klein, the Institute for International Economics. He's got a model that he's built that equalizes global currencies in order to rebalance a global trade. And I can give you the reference. I've published it in a lot of my papers. But Klein and John Williamson, they published this fundamental equilibrium exchange rates. They do it every year. But let me make another point, just to put it in context. I've estimated that if China and 4 or 5 other Asian countries revalue, it would generate about 2 million, maybe 2.25 million jobs in the United States, maybe 2/3 of those in manufacturing. Created maybe 1.5 million manufacturing jobs. In the last decade, we have lost about 6 million manufacturing jobs. That's the hole we got to fill in manufacturing. So just revaluation alone is only going to fill 1/4 of that hole. We have to do a lot more.
Yeah, if I can jump in for 1 second. I disagree with Klein and Williamson because they back into the 30 or 40% by asking the question, what would it take if you relied on currency revaluation alone? That's the wrong question, because standard economists don't think that mercantilism matters. They think that savings rates matter. So if you have a country that has industrialized through mercantilism, subsidies, quotas, preferential agreements, coercion of tech transfer, if there were a standard neoclassical economist in the room, he or she would say, that doesn't matter. By definition, it can't matter. They're only making things worse for themselves because they're distorting markets. Whereas if you take an interference with a free exchange trade, foreign exchange, oh, that matters. We understand about that. That's a market distortion. So then what they do is they say, since that's the only thing that matters, how much would it take to get rid of the trade distortion? And what they do is they leave out all the other stuff. That's the essence of the mercantilism. So I think and it gets all the other stuff off the hook if you only focus on exchange rates. But enough about me. Do you agree?
I would only quibble and say I do agree, and for another reason, they have a criteria, 3% surpluses or deficits. Right. So that's a goal, and that's not good enough.
Yes, sir.
I'd like you to tell me if my perception is correct or off base. While international trade agreements, in theory, could be beneficial by allowing countries to take care of advantage of their comparative advantages in trade to the benefit of all, I think usually the process is a very political one and not necessarily in harmony with those economic principles. And one thing that strikes me is that, as I understand it, with NAFTA and with all of the other trade agreements in this hemisphere, at any rate, the trade agreements usually require the other country, all countries, to abolish their agricultural tariffs gradually, usually over a period of 6 to 10 years. But they do not require the United States to abolish its subsidies of its agriculture. So in fact, it takes what is somewhat or more of a even trading field, a playing field, and turns it into a much more unequal trading field where U.S. agricultural producers can, even accounting for the transportation costs, can sell their products elsewhere in the hemisphere for less than it costs the Colombian or the Mexican farmer to produce their goods, thereby putting this huge amount of labor out of work and piling into the cities in Latin America and piling into the cities in the United States for their survival. And that this is quite a conscious and deliberate policy on the part of our trade agreements, which apparently works to the benefit, once again, of multinational corporations, but not to the benefit of either the majority of the people elsewhere in the hemisphere or here, because the surplus labor that's driven here drives down wages here and creates huge surplus armies of unemployed there. Is that a correct perception?
I think I certainly wouldn't disagree with anything that you say. Trade agreements have become really, as I think as Jeff Foe said, a new constitution of a global economy for multinational corporations, and they pit the interest of multinational companies against those of workers. And if you look at the process, for example, the current negotiations or a proposed Trans-Pacific partnership, there are 600 business people that sit in a room next to the negotiators and tell the government what they want in the trade agreement. And there is no role whatsoever for labor unions or for other kind of public interest groups in that process, and they've been systematically excluded from that by the Obama administration.
Yes, sir.
In your speech or your talk, you mentioned co-determination. You were discussing the West German economy and why they're so successful. I used to know what that means, but I've forgotten. So would you describe that in more detail?
I'll give you the 30-second or 15-second and leave the 10-minute to Harold. It's where there is an equal number of representatives of labor unions and of management on the board of the corporation. Is that a fair assessment, Harold?
Pretty much.
Yeah, I'll let Harold tell you. He's going to talk about the German example. He's next speaker.
Okay.
Sorry, you can't go home
then
yet.
the question is, could we do that in the United States, and if so, how?
I think that we could do that in the United States, and I think reform of corporate governance is absolutely essential. It's part of the political process that Bob was alluding to earlier. And I think before we do that, I think we're going to have to do something fundamental about reform of campaign finance laws. It was something that I recommended to my former advisor, Laura Tyson, in the months before the Clinton administration took office in 1992. They never listened to that advice, unfortunately. So.
Yes.
So two different pieces of a jobs manufacturing part of what you've been talking about. And understanding manufacturing in relation to trade and investment and multinational control, corporate control over that process, as you were describing. One is GM prioritizing investment in China. And in the context of that, and I remember hearing the CEO of GM at the Sloan School a year or so ago, several years ago, talking about how important it is, China, so important to be in China. So what's your analysis of the bailout of the automobile companies in the light of this corporate practice? And what kind of a benefit did the United States, American workers, American society get from this bailout? Did the workers get as good of a deal as they should have gotten? Did we get as good of a deal as we should be getting? And the other piece of this is the example of Caterpillar, the Caterpillar Corporation, which locked out workers in Canada who were building, I believe, diesel locomotives. They went on strike, they went a stop work action to try to prevent this demand that they take a huge wage cut. And lo and behold, Caterpillar announced they were opening a factory in Muncie, Indiana. And it's interesting that Obama launched, one of Obama's first forays into sort of manufacturing land in the United States was to visit a Caterpillar factory and tout how wonderful the corporation was. So your comment on that as well.
I'll start with the cat factory. I grew up in Indiana, and I was back there in the fall giving a talk to some of the members of the legislature about some of the key issues they were going to face this session, and the only thing they could talk about was right to work. That was the only thing that was on the agenda. That was.
You should explain what right to work is.
Right to work is a law which makes it optional for workers to pay union dues for the benefits they receive from a contract that's been negotiated on their behalf by a labor union. And it's a measure that's been adopted through, I think, about 23 states, mostly in the South and the West, but is moving north and east rapidly. There's a huge campaign on the part of Republican governors to make right to work a law in Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and elsewhere. So, of course, that the gentleman pointed out this is a priority of the Koch brothers. And so I just mentioned that it's not coincidental that Caterpillar moved its factory to Muncie, Indiana, which had just, I think, a few weeks before adopted the right to work law in Indiana, which is going to drive down wages in Indiana and do very little to create jobs. I think that's going to be what the research has shown is that right to work has very little effect, if anything, on employment. It does drive down wages. Yes, and the auto bailout. I have written critically about the auto bailout because the companies were encouraged to close down factories, and what's happened is that during the recovery there's been a huge increase in outsourcing, especially to Mexico, and so there's a huge increase in the trade deficit in autos and auto parts with Mexico that was encouraged by the Obama administration as part of the bailout plan. So as a consequence, the sales of the auto companies, and I make this point in the auto parts paper I mentioned a little while ago, the sales of auto companies are up, of the U.S. Big Three are up about 30% between 2009 and 2011, whereas employment in the auto industry was only up about half of that. So we have gotten some jobs back, and some jobs are better than no jobs, but we could have done a lot better.
Art Pollington?
I wanted to ask both of you to comment a little more about industrial policy in this following sense that I think we have industrial policy through the Pentagon, and that's hardly an original idea. In fact, I think in many ways it's very successful industrial policy, and I refer to this, I think fairly obscure, but I think important small book called Is War Necessary for Economic Growth by the late Professor Vernon Rutan, who says that if we look at all the major technical innovations that we've had, the world has had over the last 70 to 100 years, if not entirely, they've come out of the Pentagon industrial policy. And the two obvious examples, jet aviation, the computer, and the internet are three. So the point is that we believe in industrial policy. It just has to be done through the Pentagon, and it has to benefit very narrowly within that framework. So my question is, do you agree with, say, Rutan's perspective? His answer, by the way, was, is war necessary for economic growth? No, but industrial policy essentially is necessary. And we've seen that, but how can we channel that into a way that has a broader positive impact?
It reminds me of Keynes' recommendation that if you're in a recession, what you should do is pay people to dig holes and then fill them up again. You should pay people to build airplanes and then burn them. That would work. It certainly would put people back to work in the economy. There's no question about that. part of the problem, seriously, with reliance on the Pentagon as a source of industrial policy. They have been very successful in the past. For example, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Products Agency, has been incredibly successful in stimulating an array of technologies, including the internet and the semiconductors and many other advanced industrial products that have helped sustain exports to the United States. They have become less successful, I think, and partly it's because of change in a generation of management approaches at the Pentagon. I think the Pentagon now has been dominated by people who have been indoctrinated in the notion of the wonders of the global supply chain. And so Pentagon purchasing agents are going in and looking for ways to globalize everything. And so I think that therefore, the industrial policy benefits of Pentagon purchasing have gone down dramatically. And if you want to have an industrial policy, why not have one that benefits the country, that makes things that we don't have to burn up, that we can actually use? And the best examples are the ones you've talked about: clean and green technologies, infrastructure. These are things that will both create domestic jobs, make our economy more efficient, and also create demand for manufactured products that are useful.
One more quick question.
This is pretty heavy conversations going on here. One of the questions I had, just stimulated from your earlier discussion, when you get into the situation with some of the criticism of Obama, some of the things he supported or whatever, and I think you said he could have done much better. And I'm wondering, most of these things seem to center around bargaining, negotiation. You got to give something to get something passed through the Congress or whatever. And I'm just trying to determine how much of it is a blatant failure of the president versus, what he had to negotiate in order to get something else worthwhile passed through. Are we dealing with this kind of a thing for the most part?
Well, I certainly think that played a role. I think that the president had to sell this bailout to members of Congress, and I know that certainly there were negotiations down to the wire with, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the Republican senator from Tennessee who was intimately involved in these. And he was demanding more and more cuts in wages and benefits and plans. So this was this was certainly a factor in I think in the way in which that policy was made. So it's not all on Obama's. He doesn't bear all the fault for this, but the policy itself is the problem. I think it could have been more effective, and
sure.
That goes back to the political question that Bob asked earlier. How do we change the political process to make it work more efficiently? I think that's a key thing we have to look at.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pat, are you signaling me, or do you have a question?
No, I actually have a question, and
Excellent.
I'm afraid it's a big question. How did multinationals come to have so much power? How did the government cede so much power to them? And why didn't anybody see it coming?
In 1 minute, Rob.
Well, I think, again, I refer back to Jeff Foe. Jeff Foe, I think, was having, at one point, conversations about NAFTA with, in 1993, before it was actually adopted, I think, with, was it one of the Mexican leaders, I think, who said, said, I think, in room Salinas or somebody, who said that, they were making a constitution for themselves, meaning for all the rich and the powerful in Mexico, in the U.S., and in Canada, that they were establishing rules of the road for themselves and for multinationals. And that was the purpose of NAFTA, was to make the world safe for those companies. And I think it reflects the accumulation of political power, the campaign contributions that have been made by large multinationals and wealthy individuals such as the Koch brothers in the United States, they have acquired outsized influence in our political process. And we're living in a new Guild Age that reflects that, and I think that's a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed in order to develop a more effective industrial policy, more effective macro policy, do the things that we're talking about here.
And it's cumulative. The more concentrated economic power they have, the more concentrated political power they have over both parties.
Well, people, I remember, laughed at Ross Perot for his giant sucking sound and his charts and graphs that pointed down, down, down. But maybe he was onto something.
Well, my view, he was onto a piece of something. I think we got to do better than Ross Perot if we're going to have a kind of a progressive alternative leader. So let me thank Rob Scott